Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Bullets and Bourbon. Brittany Long is joining me tonight, and we have Adam Majors, author of Odysseus and joining us again. The plan is to cover a chapter a month from the book on aspects of Odysseus and that stick out to us and give voice to the importance of mental health in the military and law enforcement community. So before we get started, Adam, do you have anything that you'd like to say before we start asking the questions?
No, just thanks for having me back. So excited to talk some more about this stuff.
Absolutely. We're really happy to have you back.
Adam, I had a couple questions just to get right into it. As a brand new baby psychology student myself, I've just started my master's in psychology. And so we've like started talking about some of these theories, and then there's some that I just really haven't even heard of
Hmm.
until like looking into some of your work and your writing. Um, Jungian theories. Am I saying that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you explain to us, what that is and how that kind of ties into the things that you do and into Odysseus and the Oar?
Yes. Okay. So, uh, Carl Jung is considered to be one of the fathers of psychology. And he was born in like 1873, if I'm not mistaken. I think he died in like 1956, just to give you a sense of when he lived and when he was working. Um, but Jung was from Switzerland, and he lived a very interesting life. And just a few fun facts about Jung, real quick, with background. But when during World War One, he was actually serving in the military and was a warden at a prison camp. And then in World War II, I think that he was actually a German government official, but he was also an agent for the U.S. government. And so Dulles, I can't remember Dulles' first name, but the first director of the CIA back when it was the OSS, he was Carl Jung's handler during World War II. And one of the things he said about Jung is he's like was that most people will never know how much Jung contributed to the Allied war effort. So he was analyzing German generals and German officials, and he was feeding that information back to the Americans to help the Americans form their plans um, to take on the Nazis. So, in any case, when it comes to Jung's psychology and the work that he does, to me, it's one of the most inspiring and enchanting psychologies and psychological theories. But there's some really unique things about his view um, of the psyche that I think are probably things that would resonate with a lot of veterans and their experiences. But the first thing is that uh, when Jung came along, he was working at a place called Bergelsee, insane asylum, basically. So this is a place where people go whenever they are not doing well. And so Jung is working with people who are really, really sick and mentally ill. And this contrasts with Freud, who's working with like the bourgeoisie of Europe, right? He's working with like the ultra rich folks, and they're getting two very different perspectives of what's going on with the psyche because they're studying two very different populations, but they're also two very different people. And for Jung, he observed some things that were very, very peculiar to him, which is that one, he would work with psychotic people and he would notice their dreams and their visions and the fantasies that they would have. And Jung started observing these patterns um, in the symbolic images of these people he was working with, and also in the myths that he was studying, and in his own dreams. And so the more experience that Jung got, the more he began to develop an appreciation for the fact that all of us live with these internal images or these symbolic images that tell a story about what is going on in the psyche. And so, one of Jung's most important ideas is that of archetypes. And he says that archetypes are innate and inherited. When the occasion arises, they appear in more or less the same way in all of us. And an archetype is, you can kind of think about it like a pattern of human experience. And that when you put people in a similar situation, these these particular symbols or images will arise to express what is going on in the psyche in a symbolic form. And so, like with my book, with Odysseus and the Oar, I talk a lot about the archetype of the warrior's return. And so, if you consider the psychological situation that veterans are in, right? That, or if you just think about civilians going into warriorhood, let's start there, right? So let's take a bunch of civilians and say, well, we got to send these people to war. To prepare civilians and transform their psyches to send them to war, we have to change them in their psychology in very, very specific ways because you can't just give a dude a gun and say, go into battle. You have to prepare them psychologically. You have to change them from the inside out to do these tough jobs. And that there's a very particular set of images that go with this wild man energy. And so there's a lot of archetypal images that go along with that pattern of human experience. I mean, you can think about, the Vikings or some European or Celtic tribes where it said that they would do things to become wolves as they went into battle. You think about Alexander the Great, who was said to have identified with the image of a lion. I think in some stories or in some reports that he may have even worn a helmet that was like a lion helmet, that he took on this identity of being a beast. And that's also something that occurs in Native American culture. And in the Odyssey and in the Iliad, in both these stories, you have times in which these warriors are compared to being wild animals. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is compared to this wild beast, this lion, when he lands on the shores of the Phaeacians. So in all these stories, or in all these examples, you have that of a warrior who becomes almost animal-like. You have to become beast-like to go to war. You can't just be aligned with like ordinary human consciousness. Um, when it comes to coming home from war, though, we have a completely opposite pattern, and that as people are coming home from war, you have to help them to become human again, a whole person. And the archetype of the warrior's return, that's where you have these female figures helping to calm these warriors and helping them to come back to themselves. So this again is another archetypal pattern. It's an opposite archetypal pattern. And so Jung psychology and Jungian theory is considering the ways in which these unconscious forces are exerting themselves on the conscious personality. And it's also concerned with archetypes primarily, the way in which these archetypal forces influence human psychology on our regular experience. And so Jung was very focused on trying to relate to the unconscious and bringing the ego into relationship with the unconscious and looking at dreams and other symbols, how they appear in myths and stories. But he's also looking at things like complexes, which is something else I talk about in my book. And on the whole, all of these things, all of these terms, all these things that we're talking about right now, all of it comes back to the unconscious and the reality that there's this underlying unconscious force. You said at the beginning when you asked this question that um, you hadn't heard of Jungian theory, and or maybe it's not discussed much in the program you're in. That's very, very common. I hear that a lot. And it's important for folks to realize that the United States and our field of psychology and our training programs, we have a very, very, very heavy cognitive behavioral bias. And so we followed the likes of, Skinner, um, who basically they thought the unconscious does not exist, and that even if it did, it wouldn't matter. So the predominant the prevailing wind in American psychology is all about cognitive behavioral theory. It's all about, and we don't have to get into this, but about schema, cognitive distortions, and basically working with thoughts and behaviors to change them on the surface. And when most veterans or first responders go to get therapy, they're pretty much going to get a cognitive behavioral therapy. So,
Right. Yeah. Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. That's definitely something to do some homework into. And I think you're right. Just in and again, I'm brand new to the program and everything. I my undergrad was all sociology, criminology, you know. But even then we didn't really talk about that kind of thing. It was all, cognitive behavioral focused. Um, from like a therapeutic standpoint, how do you balance, honoring that symbolic weight of dreams and, that archetype within the dream and addressing like the tangible day-to-day struggles that veterans face? Like how do you, bridge that gap for them? And then honestly, just on a superficial level, um, how do you relate that to a veteran to where, especially somebody who's maybe resistant to therapy anyway, is a little
right.
cynical and skeptical, and they're like, "Who's this guy talking about dreams and shit?"
Yes.
How do you go through that?
Great questions. Um, so we'll start with your the I'm sorry, the last thing that you brought up there. So how do we bring this, how do you help veterans relate to this? So in my work with the Battle Within, I'm their clinical manager. And I lead the males 5-day Revenant Journey program. So I'm working with all of our male warriors that come through. And as we're introducing some of these ideas to them, one of the first things we do is we talk about, what we're here to do this week, which is we are helping them to transition, transform, and adapt to so that they can face the difficulties of their inner worlds and overcome these inner struggles. So a lot of these folks are dealing with anxiety, depression, panic attacks, huge amounts of grief, overwhelmed with like these devastating traumatic events they've been through, and they're trying to find their way through it. Most of them have done a fair amount of traditional therapy and haven't, found a lot of benefit in that. So they end up at our program, and and we let them know everything when they sign up and they come through. They know exactly what they're coming into. We give them a really in-depth description so that they know that what to expect. And one of the first things I do is I very briefly share a couple of stories with them. I tell them about the Navajo twin brother motif, and I tell them about the theft of Thor's hammer, and I tell them about the story about Kihulin coming home from battle and losing himself. And I tell them just a little bit about the Odyssey. So I give them like the 10-minute rundown of these myths. And one of the peculiar things about all four of these myths I just shared, and these are like 4 out of like 10 examples I'm aware of, is that in every single one of these stories, you have these male figures who lose themselves after being in combat. And in every case, you have this female figure helping them to come back to themselves. And I think that that kind of gets people's attention, and they think, "Wow, what a bizarre coincidence," which it's not a coincidence. What we're talking about is we're talking about the underlying symbolism of the psyche, the inherent symbolism of the psyche, as warriors are going through this transition from fighting a war to overcoming their trauma. And that ultimately, these psychological images that a lot of us experience at night in dreams are mirrored by these ancient myths. And it's our psyche's way of trying to help us come home to ourselves. And so, this is the deep stuff that is ultimately the seed that causes these pain in the ass problems we experience on the surface of everyday life. And so, I think that these myths often mirror veterans and first responders' trials in a very real way. I mean, you share the story about how the Navajo twin brothers lash out at the people in their tribe, and they scare their tribe, and the tribe sends them away out into the desert by themselves. Or Kihulin attacks his own charioteer. And when you share that story with a guy who blew up on his coworkers last week and is tired of having everyone tell him he's a little bit of an asshole, it tends to get people's attention. They're like, okay, hold on, what do I have to learn from this? And so for me, I think that myths are a really good doorway into doing this deeper work with our own dreams, when you see it mirror your own experience in that kind of way.
Well
So
put. Yeah.
So when serving overseas, you tend to walk a fine line. And, I don't know if any of y'all or even the listeners read the book Black Hearts, but you can see in that book what a poor command climate and atrocious leadership can lead to. I mean, that book perfectly illustrates what type of leadership you don't want and the degradation of authority and how people act. And in one of the previous episodes with Brittany's mom, I talked about, the book a little bit where, you know, it caused chaos to the point where there were members in a platoon that left their FOB, their forward operating base, and they broke into a house, killed a family, and raped a girl.
Hmm.
And I mean, that's an extreme example right there, but it perfectly illustrates the evil that resides in individuals when not held accountable. And we see it throughout history between the Romans, the Celts, the Vikings, even knights during the medieval period. Like, they're not perfect people, war changes you. But how would you describe a warrior based off of your experiences and based off of your education?
Well, it's a tough question to answer, because I think it is complex, and um, I appreciate this question. I think it's a good segue from where we just were and some of the things we've touched on so far tonight. But um, when I think that there's countless examples of the ones like you just gave where warriors kind of lose touch with themselves. And especially in a combat environment, when shit gets really bad, I mean, you can really get caught up in the dark side of the warrior energy. And Carl Marlantes, right? So anybody who's not familiar with Carl Marlantes, you want to look him up. But he was gracious enough to write the foreword for my book. But he's a highly decorated, U.S. Marine Corps infantry officer during Vietnam, and he's a very powerful voice when it comes to, um, the things that we need to do to be better about the way that we help warriors transition. But he wrote a book called What It Is Like to Go to War. And one of the things that he says is that um, we can get swallowed up by this Mars energy. And when he says Mars, he's referring to the Roman god of war, the
Hmm.
equivalent of the Greek god of war, Ares. And he's saying that when we end up in these environments, we can be swallowed by that archetypal energy. It can possess us, and we can lose our own identity in a way, right? That the conscious ego is supplanted and pushed out of the way by this powerful archetypal energy, which it's one of the realities of the human psyche and something that Jung recognized is that the ego has to have things in place to protect itself from being swallowed up by that or from being possessed by or taken over by this energy. And given a particular context, when things get really ugly and really bad, and there's not good leadership and good boundaries and a very well balanced warrior culture in place, that's when stuff can go south. Jonathan Shea, who is a psychiatrist that worked for the VA, he wrote a couple of books. One of them is called Achilles in Vietnam. And he talks about this subject in that book. And he talks about going berserk, right? Becoming possessed by that wild man energy, becoming the wolf or the lion or the bear, and just losing your shit and doing bad things to people who had nothing to do with the actual war. And so this is a very real thing. It was something that we've experienced in every war. We've seen it in all the American conflicts, and I think in every war that's ever been. Um, and I think one of the things about the American military that is important, right? And I know that there are plenty of critics out there. I can think of people who think that the U.S. military is this bad, evil thing. Yeah, and I, of course, do not agree with that whatsoever. Um, but the U.S. military works very, very, very hard to instill a professional warrior culture
Hmm.
with values, loyalty, duty, respect, honor, integrity, personal courage. I mean, you think about, all these different values that exist across the services. We are trained to do the right thing, and we are trained to be good and to be a force of good and not to hurt people who are innocent and to work very, very hard to do that. I mean, shit, when I was in Baghdad, through most of my time in Baghdad, we could not pull a trigger unless we were actively being engaged and we had positive identification of someone who was pulling a trigger shooting at us.
Yep.
Like they had
Y-
to be actively shooting at us. We could not. And so, like, if a dude shot a gun, dropped it, and started running, you could not engage that guy. That
Yep.
was that was the
I mean,
rules.
the standing rules of engagement back then were, um, you fire back when you're engaged. You have positive identification. Like when my friend Larry got killed, like those insurgents left the house where they killed Larry, jumped out the back window, went to another house. We knew it was them, but because they had removed the magazine, dropped the weapon, and knowingly that they killed our friend, because they had done that, we could not kill them as
Yep.
much as we wanted to.
Right.
We have standing rules of engagement that we had to abide by.
Yep. And because of our training and our culture, I think that that's why you guys didn't. And I think that, you look at what's going on in Ukraine right now, and I've seen plenty of videos of war crimes from the Russians just executing, Ukrainian POWs and whatnot. And I think that our warrior culture, the way that the U.S. military operates, is we put these strict boundaries around soldiers and Marines because we know that if we don't, and if we don't have a strict uniform code of military justice, these powers will cause us to do the wrong things. And ultimately, no matter how good your boundaries are, under the right conditions, some people will still snap.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
I mean, it happens. And so, um, all that to say, I mean, how I view the average warrior, how I describe the warrior, and I think the ideal and my ideal, right? I think that in my ideal, we would train warriors a lot like we train them now because you need warriors to be killers,
Hmm.
but they also have to have very, very strong boundaries and very, very strong values, and that the warrior culture needs to be mature enough to kind of hold the tension between the opposites. And I think that one of the things that we need to do as a culture is to make them more conscious of the way that these energies influence them. That's something that Carl Marlantes advocates for as well. Because if you're unconscious about it, if you're unaware that this happens, that's when the danger comes that you just become possessed by it.
Hmm.
So I see a mature warrior as someone who can both fight and be compassionate, you know?
Absolutely.
Adam, how dangerous is it to constantly keep that archetypal image of the warrior on, so to speak? How do you feel, for people like Matt that have worked, in the military space after getting out, what can they do to better adjust to life, even though, they're still kind of in that same space, or it's still like a very deep-rooted part of the identity?
Yeah, great. You guys are asking amazing questions. So here's how I like to think about this, right? So a little background and theory again. So, um, we'll think about the law of inertia, right? So an object at rest stays at rest, an object in motion stays in motion until a force of equal or greater measure acts upon it or slows it down. That could include something like friction, right? In Jungian psychology, we consider that there's something that is like a psychic law of inertia. And so if you think about this archetypal warrior energy that gets set into motion in basic training, it gets reinforced and even further activated. It builds up even more mass and more speed when we get to our unit and we do training there. And the culture is reinforcing it and pushing us along. And we identify with that image and with that energy more and more and more. You go to combat, and there it really gains speed and mass, and it's like a boulder rolling down a hill, right? This thing's getting bigger and bigger and more powerful, and it's picking up steam. And then all of a sudden, one day, your time in the service ends, And now that's when that friction starts to act upon it, right? Because you're out of that culture. You're not doing the training anymore necessarily, or maybe you are. You know, that I know plenty of veterans who maintain similar preparation, and just in their work with firearms or maybe doing contracting and things like that. But I think once we're out of the job, that's where suffering can kind of kick in on a new level. And from a Jungian perspective, we see suffering as a voice of the soul. We don't see suffering as a thing to like medicate and get rid of. We see suffering as something that we need to open the door to, welcome in, and let it speak to us and teach us so that we can be changed. So, uh, in my view, when this suffering comes in, uh, one of the things that we can do is treat it like it's a teacher. You know, I've heard some Jungians say that we should treat our depression. I think Jung might have said that um, that when depression comes along, you treat it like a little old lady. You know, you open the door, you make it a cup of tea, and say, "Come on in. What do you have to teach me? Tell me what you have to say." You know, and that for a lot of warriors, I think it's extremely dangerous to stay identified with that image. And that the key is that if we can make space for our suffering to come in, for other parts of us to come in, um, to get in touch with the inner child or with this female figure that's symbolized in all these myths about warriors' returns, if we can make room for these other parts of us so that we can relate to our suffering in a loving, nurturing, compassionate way, we can find a way to kind of hold the tension between these opposites where, a guy like Matt, Matt's still working with the military, still very involved in his work, shooting and competing, and that you can do all those things and still be a hard ass, and you can still tend to your suffering. You can become conscious of these forces, and you can make room for all these parts of you that did not have room to exist when you're in the military. So I'm a big believer that you can do both, and that you can still maintain um, a role as a warrior without letting it completely and entirely possess you.
Yeah, kind of just redirect that energy into something productive and that feels good and builds up that sense of individual a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be either or, and
Right.
that's something that we see in the Odyssey. So when Odysseus goes through the overwhelming majority of his transformation process and he lands at the with the Phaeacians, there's a part where he is mourning and he is grieving as he's facing these reminders of his time in Troy fighting the Trojans. And then right after that, this dude insults him and challenges him. And at first he's like, "Come on, man. I'm beat down. Please leave me alone." And the dude eggs him on and, is basically just starting shit with him. And Odysseus stands up and is like, "Dude, don't you dare fuck with me." And then he does. He takes him on. They compete, and Odysseus kicks his ass. Um, and so I think that there's this knowledge that even the ancient Greeks say, even though you embrace the softer side and the compassionate, nurturing aspect of the personality to tend to your wounds, you can also still be a hard ass. It can be both. It doesn't have to be either or.
I love that.
Yeah. And I think it kind of segues into this aspect too. And for those who only served 4 years or even made a career, we've obviously stayed connected with certain friends we've served with, and we've all seen the inflation of the ego all too often. It's a form of power, even protection, a connection to a past life that can be all too dangerous. What are ways that we can de-escalate ourselves or even others who may still suffer from that ego?
So, it's another really good question. Um, I feel like that's reflected by the Odyssey as well. And there's a scene in the Odyssey where Odysseus has been given this bag of winds that's just going to carry him straight home to Ithaca. And so he's got this bag of winds, and Odysseus decides he's going to um, steer the ship all by himself. So he's not going to let anyone else, any of his men, take a turn at the wheel. He's just going to do it all on his own. So kind of a big ego moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he's really inflated. He's overestimating what he can do, what he's capable of. And he's trying to sail home for 10 days and nights straight without letting anybody else have a turn at the wheel. And eventually he falls asleep right when his homeland is on the horizon. And when he does, his men who are jealous because they've been left out, and I kind of think about the men, if we approach this from the perspective of Jungian psychology, that these would represent aspects of Odysseus himself, that these are the neglected parts of his own psyche. They go to open the bag to see what's there, and when they open the bag of winds, it blows them all the way back to where they started. And there's this kind of experience of undoing where all the progress seems to be lost. And I think that for a lot of us as veterans, we have these different tendencies and some really common tendencies. A lot of us tend to be kind of type A workaholics. We tend to overdo things. We tend to overestimate what we should take on. We can get ourselves into trouble sometimes by thinking that we can do things now the way that we used to when we were 20 years old and full of piss and vinegar. And really, I think that one of the healthiest things any of us can do is to make it a daily habit to do a bit of an ego check. And before we take new things on or before we start new endeavors, just to pull out your journal and get into this practice of being like, all right, let's have a little council meeting, well, have a little board meeting, right? And imagine all these different parts of you sitting at a table and just check in like your inner child, the wounded part of you, the part of you that's been wounded by war, the part of you that's exhausted, the part of you that has these different goals, the part of you that wants to redecorate your bedroom or that wants to go hunting here in a few weeks, whatever it is. And so you sit down and you have this counsel and say, which parts of me need attention? Which parts of me need to have some needs met? Gosh, there's this part of me that was feeling anxious a lot this past week. What does that part of me need? Before we just let that inner warrior take over and say, hey, let's go knock down some walls and do some crazy shit and give ourselves a bunch of stuff to do that maybe isn't so good for us. And so I think that's where, um, ultimately what we're trying to do is we are trying to create a bit of diversity in the psyche, making room for all these different parts of ourselves that could be life-giving and restorative and healing versus just letting, that hard ass that likes to chew on nails run the show.
No, I think, you know, that that's powerful. Because that's something that is missing in a lot of us, and we tend to divert back to what we know, what we did, and it becomes our identity. Um, and and it kind of leads into the next aspect where, you know, you hear about Vietnam and World War II, World War II, the greatest generation, and those guys went, fought the war, kept the world free from, evil. You have Vietnam where those guys were chastised coming home and they never talked about it. So for like my grandparents who served, came back, they never really talked about the war. Korea was forgotten about. Vietnam, they were treated so badly and suffered from PTSD that they shut away and never spoke of their experience. And in your book, you stated most people wear T-shirts nowadays that say dysfunctional veteran. At what point does this become okay? And I understand, like, we all, in today's generation, we embrace dark humor and everything. I mean, I do too. But what was a trend that led to this change? For me, I can talk about my experiences to people that I trust, or if I'm teaching lessons, and can correlate those lessons to the experience, to use an example. But then you have stuff like VetTV, which albeit it's funny and hilarious, but we're showing a darker side of the human psyche to people, to some stuff that could have or could not have happened. And then, we have 22 push-ups a day challenge, which, although it's a good cause, what really is that doing for people other than just showing, hey, I'm doing 22 push-ups, to support, veteran suicide. And, the list goes on. Are these honorable or do they perpetuate the problem?
Well, again, great question and really complex. I want to say a few things. So, one of the most difficult things that, all veterans and all generations deal with is the burden of collective projections from the society, right?
Hmm.
And for anybody who's not familiar with like what projection means, right? That's where we take something that's inside of us that's unconscious and we project it onto someone else and assume that someone else is a certain way just because of, the image that they carry. And I think that every generation has kind of held at least a few different kinds of projections. And so you, some of the common projections, at least in American culture, are like the good boy veteran hero, right?
Hmm.
Or like the bad boy dysfunctional veteran, right?
Yeah.
And or even like the baby killer, right? That people project either their own gold or their own darkness onto veterans. So whatever is unconscious in them ends up being projected onto veterans. Now, Mary Louise von Franz, who is one of Jung's students and colleagues, um, she says like projections are by no means harmless affairs that affect, no one. She said they're very harmful. These are when you project something onto someone, it affects the person it lands on. And there's something in psychology that we call projective identification. And you can kind of think of it like that when someone's projecting something onto you, or maybe there's a whole crowd of people projecting something onto you, it starts to affect your own psychology. And you might even start to act out in the way that they expect you to act out. And I think that's a little bit of like, I think a lot of veterans feel that in different ways. And I think it's been happening in every war, in history, at least in American culture. But, I think there are a lot of veterans who feel compelled to uphold that like good boy veteran image, that I'm going to be an upright citizen and a hard worker and an entrepreneur big, and that they might be doing that unconsciously because of the pressure to be a certain kind of person. That's what it means to be a good veteran, a good productive veteran, you know? And maybe they never even stop to ask themselves what they really want or who they really are. They just go straight into a job and lose themselves in a new task without ever really having a chance to transform or heal. And on the other hand, I think that there's a lot of veterans that have really struggled and that have not had good support to find their way, and they're suffering, and they're having a hard time, and they're making mistakes, and they're blowing up on family members and friends, and they're getting divorces, and they know they drink too much, and they eventually get to the point where they're just like defeated. They're like, fuck it. You know what? I'm buying the disgruntled veteran shirt. I'm buying the dysfunctional veteran shirt. Fuck it. That's who I am. I'm just gonna own it. Everybody treats me like I'm a fuck up, and I'm just gonna own the image. Like why have any pride? You
I
know?
think you just really, really in a great way summed up labeling theory and like deviance behavior.
Yep.
It's sociological theories. Um, just that like self-fulfilling prophecy and like the idea that whatever that label is, whether it's, it's an outside source and you don't want to buy into it at first, eventually it is self-fulfilling. Eventually you buy into it and you're like, you know what, that's exactly what I am.
Yeah.
And
Fuck
just
it.
kind of that, yeah, like it's almost you belong to that subset, like that other group in society because other these people understand you and these
Yes.
ones that are imposing the label don't. So I belong here, and even though it's like kind of fucked up, kind of edgy, like I kind of belong to that and I can kind of take back ownership of it in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's one of those things where I try to be careful about pathologizing things, and I'm not a Buddhist, but I'm very fond of the way that Buddhists often hold things. And one of the uh, general principles that they have is like no judgment, no criticism, you know? That if I see something like somebody in a disgruntled or dysfunctional veteran shirt, I try to just, you know, um, I try to appreciate that as a sign that they might be suffering and not know what to do with it, and probably feel like they're a little bit of an outcast, um, and maybe a little bit tired of just the way that they've been treated in our society, you know. And it's one of those things where it's like, man, it's a big change from past generations. I mean, you know, Matt, it's really hard to imagine our grandparents wearing those shirts,
Oh, absolutely.
you
And
know?
I mean, I just remember, like, my grandparents opening up to me whenever I was a young age, my Uncle Ed and my granddad, uh, telling me of their experiences in World War II and how long it took for them to actually speak to those experiences. And the same thing with my wife, her granddad never said a word to any family member about what he had done in the war. And he was in the British military, and they were in the war from 1939 on until the war ended. He fought in 5 theaters of combat. He was
Wow.
the original SAS, Detachment L, um, and he never spoke to it. And she was doing a project for school and interviewed him, and she was the only person he opened up to. um and she did a whole report on his experiences in the North African campaign and how he was a POW and met Rommel, and then fighting in Italy. And then there was a couple of places, like, and how he got wounded in Burma and then got flown to Iraq and Baghdad, escaped from the hospital in Baghdad, and joined his, troop again. But
Amazing.
nobody ever heard of those experiences until he opened up to her. And it's like,
Yes.
now you know, it's common for me to talk about it, but that's because I've been in the space for 20 years and just now retired, and I'm still working in that space. So I use those experiences in war to educate. But so I don't know, because I've been around it for so long. I don't know what half the other people do, but I mean, I guarantee you they talk about their experiences just one and the same with other people that they're comfortable with.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that what you just said is such a wonderful example to highlight that although we have definitely there's some challenges that we have in our culture with veterans mental health. Man, the challenges of the so-called greatest generation, you know, the World War II generation, those were significant. I mean, the code of silence and some of the burdens those veterans carried in terms of a code of silence, you know, and that back then, like if you were to share something, you know, people might have assumed there was something wrong with you or that you were
Hmm.
weak. You know, it's like you could not talk about it. I'm sure for a lot of them, I mean, the anxiety of talking about it and the desire to avoid the pain of re-experiencing it by talking about it. And back in like 2013, when I first started doing my nonprofit work, I used to interview influential veterans and talk to them about their experiences. And one of the folks I talked with was Herb Seworth from the 506 The Easy Company,
Mm,
you know, Band of Brothers.
yeah.
And he lost his leg or legs in Bastogne. And but you know, talking to Herb, you know, he did not really start talking about this stuff until the Band of Brothers series came out.
Well,
You know,
you look at the Pacific, for instance, Eugene Sledge or Robert Leckie. Eugene Sledge wrote with the Old Breed, and then Robert Leckie wrote Helmet for My Pillow. And those books didn't get published until what, 30 years after they left the war,
Yeah.
which is a significant amount of time. And for some people, it's, for some of the books, they came out even much later.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, Talking about Easy Company, Dick Winters, he wrote his book Beyond Band of Brothers, talking about his experiences being in command, starting out as a platoon commander and having to deal with Herbert Sobel all the way up until the end of the war, where he was the battalion commander.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's significant.
Yeah. And I think that I'm getting goosebumps as we're talking about this because one of the things, like we look at the so-called greatest generation, right? And one of the things that's happening is we idealize them.
Hmm.
And the reason we idealize them is we're projecting shit onto them. That as a culture, we idealize that generation of warriors and we think they're so great. They did this right. And I've even heard people say, I've heard modern veterans say, um, well, I actually I can think about someone I know. I'm not gonna say anything to reveal this person's identity, but they said like, well, look at the greatest generation. I mean, they weren't a bunch of pussies. They didn't come home and cry about it. They just got back to work and picked themselves up by them bootstraps and they built the greatest country on the planet.
And
You know,
realistically, you don't know that. You don't know what they were going through. You don't know how they suffered on their own. And
yes,
I think a show, granted, it was a historical show. I think they did a really good job in showing the return of Eugene Sledge and Robert Leckie and
yeah,
what they did go through. And there's other movies out there that kind of depict that too, like Flags of Our Fathers. Like they did suffer, but they did it in solitude.
yeah, and I think that's a great example. I mean, I have a family member um, who was in World War II, and this person is not kindly remembered by any of his children. He's not looked up to as like a great dad. And he did some important work after the war, but I mean, you know, wasn't a very healthy guy. And I had a grandfather who fought in Vietnam, and after he retired from the army, I mean, he basically sat in a chair, wasting away, drinking whiskey and smoking cigarettes, and never leaving his home. And so, and you can look into the stories of Audie Murphy
Mm-hmm. Oh
and
yeah.
folks like
He
that.
suffered.
He suffered. He did not live a happy life.
Oh no, I mean, he suffered so much PTSD, trauma, and depression. America's most decorated soldier to have ever lived almost didn't get into the army and won every honor you could in the
Yep.
army single-handedly. He was what, 5'2", something like
Yep.
that.
Right.
Suffered from asthma. He was from the Dust Bowl. Had to raise his siblings. Um, Comes back and I mean, he gets out of the military and he just suffers and then he dies in a plane crash, what, in the 1970s?
Yeah, and I would say, one of the most important parts about his legacies too is after the war. So he did all these badass things in the military,
Mm-hmm.
but then he was one of the only fucking people who talked about the hardships of coming home.
Yeah.
And he went before Congress. He advocated for the government to do more to support veterans. He spoke about the way in which it, destroys a person's soul to go through these things. And to me, I mean, I think I mean, to me, he is the example of, courage on and off the battlefield and having the courage to speak to these problems at a time in which the code of silence was, deeply enforced.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and so to me, I mean, I just have so much admiration, for the things that he did for all of us, so we could be sitting here now doing this you know, um, to be having conversations about, the way that war affects a person.
Yeah. No, no, and I think this was a great conversation, and I think this is a good stopping point here before we do our next episode. But before we do sign off, do you have anything that you would like to leave the listeners with?
No, I'm just again thankful to be here, and I want to just let anybody listening know that if they're wrestling, with their military identity and how much of it they can let themselves, own and keep around, just do some deep listening with yourself, and as somebody who's been out of the military now for, um, oh my gosh,
15 years?
yeah, like I guess 13 years. Um, been out of the military for 13 years. I've been home from Iraq for God, have I been home for 16 years? How long ago was 2008?
A while, 16 years
Oh,
probably.
Yeah,
see, good Lord Almighty.
almost 17.
Oh my gosh. I'm having like a holy shit, am I really almost that old kind of moment.
Yes,
And
yes, yes, you are.
but after all this and all the therapies and the years of analysis and working with my dreams and working with other veterans now for a decade, um, I mean, for me, it's, I'm going to get out and get to go hunting this next week. And I have these little moments where, um, I'm reminded about how exciting it was to, put my gear on and get out and go on a ruck march or to go on a mission. And there's these little things I do in civilian life now that remind me of those moments. And I don't think there's anything wrong with maintaining a healthy connection to your identity that, you know, there's nothing wrong with, wearing a shirt or a hat or doing these things that keep you in touch with your identity. You should be proud of it. And I don't think that it's good for us to compensate and to go the other way, where we just try to cut that identity off and pretend it never existed. I think that the healthy thing that all of us need to do is find a way to integrate that identity so it can stay a part of us. I mean, you look at the Native Americans, that they might have been a warrior when, once and young, but they might wear a headdress for the rest of their lives, and that we shouldn't pathologize keeping some healthy connection to your military identity, because then I think that's the way, and we end up compensating and going all the way in the other direction.
Hmm.
Um, so I just want to make sure that anybody who's listening to our discussion tonight doesn't feel any sense of shame or feel like they shouldn't keep a connection to their military identity. I think it's really good to find a way to keep that alive, in some way that feels balanced to you.
Absolutely. And, I think about that all the time because it's like, man, am I going too far into one direction or too far into another direction? Like, I'm out now. Should I really be sharing some of this stuff? And at the end of the day, it's like, well, why not? That was such a big part of my life.
Yep.
I should still be able to identify with some of these things and I should still be able to share some of these stories. And, it's a part of who we are as people and it's experiences that we went through. And if it can help, why not? If it
Yep.
can make somebody laugh, why not?
Yeah, it's sacred. And to me, this is, one of the things Jung talked about was alchemy. And he saw alchemy as kind of this process through which the alchemists were projecting the inherent imagery of the individuation process onto this early science of making gold. And for me, these experiences are the basic ingredients that we need in our own alchemical process to make our psychological or spiritual gold. That by working with these parts of our history and our identity, we can become, the fullest, most whole version of ourselves. So never feel ashamed of it. Don't feel like you have to cut it off or throw it away or hide it, and on the other side of things, you don't want to let it completely possess you and take over everything either. So
No,
thank
I
you guys again
appreciate
for
that.
having me.
Absolutely. Thank you for
Yeah,
coming on
thanks,
again.
Adam.
Of course, thank you guys. So we'll look forward to the next time.
Absolutely. And to the listeners out there, we hope you really enjoyed this. We hope you get something out of this. And we hope you keep coming back. But have a good one, and we'll see you next time.